Welcome, everybody. So, my name is Stephanie Cadaval, and I am the Urban Forestry Extension Coordinator here at UF. We're based out of the School of Forest, Fisheries, and Geomatic Sciences, and I want to thank you for joining us for our Urban Forestry Extension Council Speaker Series event. We've got some folks from around the state of Florida joining us today, which is wonderful. And this event is formatted as a lunch and learn. So you're going to hear from our invited speaker, and then we can all engage in a conversation together with them and each other about the topic that we just learned about. It can be a little bit more casual than maybe your typical presentation. And we do encourage folks to bring and eat your lunch if you'd like. We do host this during lunchtime. And I ask that as you listen to the presentation, please go ahead and share your questions in the chat so that we can address them at the end of our event in our questions and conversations half of this talk. We're also going to be recording this presentation so that we can share it later on our website. Since this is a new series, I'll also ask that you please participate in some feedback. So I'm going to show at the end of this talk a slide with a QR code, and that has a survey on it so that you can share some of your feedback on this presentation and this series. And I'll leave about 5 minutes or so at the end so that we can do that, we can wrap up, and I can share with you a little bit about our next invited guest. And just participating in that feedback survey will help us learn about your experience, and it will help us shape future events like this one. All right, so I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker, Dr. Taylor Clem. Dr. Taylor Clem is the County Director and Horticulture Extension Agent with UF IFAS Extension in Nassau County. He holds degrees in landscape architecture and a doctorate in horticultural sciences. He is also a certified Florida-friendly landscaping professional, and his work focuses on helping communities adopt sustainable landscaping and gardening practices. Welcome, Taylor.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invite. Let me go ahead and open up my presentation for today. All right. So, got to rearrange some things. Wonderful. Well, again, thank you, Stephanie, for inviting me to come and speak today. And thank you for everybody that's joined in. At any time, feel free to ask any questions that you may have, etc. But today's program, we're calling Community Canopy Conservation, a case study in a community's effort in protecting an urban canopy on southern Amelia Island. And again, my name is Dr. Taylor Clem, and I'm the County Extension Agent, or County Extension Director, as well as a Community and Commercial Horticulture Extension Agent here in Nassau County. So let me tell you a little bit of background about Nassau County. So Nassau County, we're in the far northeast corner of Florida, and we have grown by 19.5% since 2020, and we're the 9th fastest growing county in the state. We're having an increased rate of change. So our community is growing rapidly. We're going from a traditionally very rural, agricultural, natural area kind of county, and we're urbanizing. So we're developing pretty quickly. And even at that, since 2017, any type of planned unit development or PUD or in subdivisions within Nassau County have to be part of a property or a homeowners association. So we're seeing a lot of growth. We're seeing a lot of change. And today, of course, we're going to be focusing on specifically Amelia Island. But just looking at what's going to be happening in the future of Nassau County as an urbanizing community. I remember coming into Nassau County when I was a kid. I grew up on the south side of Jacksonville, but it was very rural. It was great. You get off the interstate and you'd have this drive along 200 before you get to Amelia Island or the city of Fernandina Beach. But we have grown a lot in that period. And we have over 30,000 homes already encumbered in Nassau County that is going to be built as part of our growth. As you can kind of see where the big, large pink area, that multi-use land use is going to be occurring. But then even if you look on the right side of the image, you see the land use of Amelia Island. On the southern portion of Amelia Island, south of Fernandina Beach, there is a lot of multi-use land use. There is a medium density and high density all occurring already on the south part of Amelia Island. And one of the really cool things I like about Amelia Island, it makes it really stand out, is A, this is a barrier island, and this barrier island has a unique environment of maritime forest, and those maritime forests expand from the Carolinas all the way into southern part of Florida. But of course, the species and diversity richness is different in each of those environments. But one of the really cool things about Amelia Island and that south part of Amelia Island, specifically for this conversation, is how the community has been able to grow and develop with its canopy in place. And I love this photo of southern Amelia Island. You're actually looking down onto the Omni Resort, but in that photo, you see a lot of that maritime forest on southern Amelia Island. And in that maritime forest, you're having mixed use land use, commercial, there's institution, there's that high density, medium density housing, yet we're still seeing this character of this maritime forest existing on a barrier island, which is pretty unique if you look at the development type and patterns on a barrier island in Florida. This type of density with urban canopies does not really exist that much within the state. So it makes this part of Southern Amelia Island a really unique case study. So, and that's what we're going to present today. It's going to talk about the history of what's occurred on the southern part of Amelia Island, as well as how to shape the decisions and practices that are happening today, as well as what is the extension's role kind of helping support that process as well. So, on the southern portion of Amelia Island is what we actually call the Amelia Island Plantation. And on Amelia Island Plantation, about 1,200 acres of maritime forest, marshlands, lakes, dunes, and beaches. And it's managed by over 2,000 homeowners. It's part of the Amelia Island Plantation Association, so that's like the managing board. But there's also the Omni Hotels and the Amelia Island Club, and they are all managing this 1,200 acre portion of southern Amelia Island. And it's really important because a few years ago, the board of directors of Amelia Island Plantation, they've always been a huge proponent of, hey, we have this beautiful maritime forest. And as such, it's kind of blended itself into the cultural and social dynamics of the community. But the board of directors tasked a new committee, which is called the Environmental Assets Committee, to ultimately, how do we recover our natural areas that have been impacted? How do we maintain what's existing? And then how do we help enhance those areas as well going into the future? So ideally, they want to have those natural areas to recover, maintain, and enhance to help with the social, economic, and environmental viability of the entire community. So they started thinking, like, how do we push this community even further into the future, thinking about this natural canopy or this urban canopy or all these different environmental assets within the community. And they recently finished and developed this plan. It's the Environmental Assets Committee Baseline Asset Study. I know it's not the most exciting name, but it's an incredibly important guiding document that the Environmental Assets Committee has developed. This document essentially is going to start outlining the task that can be done by the community over the next 5, 10, 15 years, kind of like a strategic plan and prioritization to help go back to those priorities, like I mentioned, recover, maintain, and enhance those natural areas. So this is that baseline data. So within this baseline data, we've outlined the environmental conditions of their canopy, not just their canopy, but we also outlined environmental conditions of the beaches and dunes, um, the streams, creeks, ponds, as well as like the marsh areas. And we took a lot of environmental data because our goal is, by looking at these different components of the Environmental Assets Committee or these different areas of Amelia Island Plantation, that we can say, hey, as we do these specific tasks or these specific projects moving into the future, we know how well we are doing. Essentially, this is the baseline data that allows the community to say, be more targeted in their approach and decision making and evaluation to say, we did these things, here is the impact that it's generated. So this is that baseline asset study to help guide their evaluation and decision making for their entire community and how they're managing their canopies, their marsh areas, their dunes, their beaches, etc. So, but this is like a great stepping stone because thinking for a community to create a guiding document, such as something we'd see communities do, or municipalities do, or governments do with like strategic plans or comp plans, this is something very equitable to that for a neighborhood association. But ultimately, how did they get to this point? We're thinking about how does a community get to the point where they're saying we need to create this plan, this assets plan, in order to think about how we're going to manage our natural areas within our entire community. It's not something they just woke up one day and decided that they were going to do. It took something that required nurturing, and it took patience, and it was like a storied. It's a story that's still progressing and evolving over time. But ultimately, when I think about how did we get to this point, I come to one key term that we use in like landscape architecture and planning, and that is placemaking. Placemaking. So placemaking, I'm quoting the Project for Public Spaces on this just because I really like their definition that they use. But placemaking is a hands-on approach for improving a neighborhood, city, or region. Placemaking inspires people to collectively reimagine and reinvent public spaces as the heart of every community. Strengthening the connection between people and the places they share, placemaking refers to a collaborative process by which we can shape our public realm in order to maximize shared value. So, cultural history. There's a richness to this. So when you go and you talk to a lot of people on Amelia Island, we have NGOs or nonprofit organizations that really like ones like Conserve Nassau and the Amelia Tree Conservancy, where they're focusing on conservation efforts and maintaining maritime forest on Amelia Island. And so much of it is rooted to the understanding and appreciation of and value and uniqueness that Amelia Island has with its maritime forest on a barrier island. So, because of that cultural significance, there starts to be this placemaking that exists. A community comes together and they define themselves based off of this shared experiences. But part of that is really kind of interesting to think about what's the history of Amelia Island plantation, because that actually plays a huge role in the decision making today and how they're moving forward. So I'm going to kind of jump through the really cool history, and I love this history because I geek out over it as a landscape architect. So, but anyways, and I'll show you why I geek out in a second, but we'll go through this kind of quickly. But nonetheless, Amelia Island Plantation, just to kind of go through its history, the property that it's on was originally purchased or was purchased by the Union Carbide. And ideally, well, not ideally, at the time prior to Amelia Island Plantation, it was supposed to be a titanium strip mine. Imagine a titanium strip mine on a barrier island in Florida. That wasn't going to be the best idea. So, but luckily, obviously, that did not happen. Um, but this guy came along. His name is Charles Frazier. He's actually a developer from the Carolinas. And I love this photo of him walking with an alligator. And I think that is a photo on Cumberland Island because originally Charles Frazier bought a huge tract of land from the Carnegie family, and that tract of land was actually on Cumberland Island before it was a designated national seashore. So if you actually look at aerial images of Cumberland Island, you can see where Charles Frazier in the late 70s started to secretly cut out an airfield in some of the roadways on Cumberland Island. But there's a lot of pressure. And Charles Frazier ended up selling that land to the state of Georgia and ended up moving his development idea to Amelia Island, to the southern portion of Amelia Island. And that his company, Sea Pines, purchased the entire south portion, that 1,500 or 1,200 acres for $4.6 million. Imagine doing that today, how much that would cost today. But, and this was an article specifically from 1970, December of 1970. So, and that's when it traded hands from the Carbide Company to the Sea Pines. But ultimately, this is what Amelia Island Plantation uh, master plan was unveiled in 1972. But one of the really cool things about Charles Frazier's vision is he wanted to actually create, because A, he found it economically feasible and he found it as a way to help make money as well. But one of his big motivators for the development of Amelia Island Plantation is he wanted a commitment to balancing development while preserving the natural beauty of the island. So what they wanted to try to do is already is like how to create an environment, this built environment that we're balancing built and natural environments together. And a lot of these, like this master plan and some of the other images you're going to see actually come from Landscape Architecture magazine from 1972 because of one of the articles that they had in there about this project, which was really cool. So, but anyways, Charles Fraser, the commitment to balancing development while preserving the natural beauty of the island. So who did he hire to do this? This is where I start to geek out a little bit. He hired a team of environmental specialists. Specifically, he hired a group called Wallace McHarg Roberts Todd, or WMRT, which is now just called WRT. And what they ended up doing is they didn't necessarily create the entire design, but they kind of created the foundation for the design to say, how do we balance that built and natural environment? And the person in the top right, he is one of the most influential people in landscape architecture. And that company, the WRT, actually uses this, or WMRT, this has become like a legacy project for them. But an influential project by one of the most influential landscape architects of the 20th century, his name is Ian McHarg. Ian McHarg is laid the foundations for using ecology as a basis for design and planning. We call these things McHargian analyses. So essentially, Ian McHarg, who's pictured here on the right, is a Scottish landscape architect. Um, and he was one of the founding members of WMRT in 1963. But his most notable contribution to landscape architecture and planning, which has evolved from just a basic idea to, if you ever use GIS, you're using McHargian analysis practices. Anytime that we're using any type of ArcGIS data, it comes back to Ian McHarg. So essentially, he created this McHargian analysis. And the idea that he used was called design with nature. So allow our environments to determine the shape, feel, and limit of our urban and built environments. How do we prioritize different environmental characteristics and conditions? And it was just called the McHargian analysis, but essentially it's a spatial and a temporal analysis of data. And he wrote this book, Design with Nature. You can buy some of the original publications on this, but they cost a few $100. But it was published in 1969, so before Amelia Island Plantation Project began. But design with nature was the way we occupy and modify the earth is best when planned and designed with careful regard to both the ecology and the character of the landscape. So that is a quote from the McHarg Center, which is just kind of like think of a presidential library, but for Ian McHarg. But ultimately, by following these basic principles of designing with nature, we can create communities that are resilient. They create stronger place and identity, as well as they can have regenerative landscapes. So we're thinking about stronger place and identity. It really relates to what Amelia Island Plantation is already experiencing. Is they have this identity that their community is part of the environment. And it's really interesting because sometimes when you'll talk to people, they won't say that, you know, there's a maritime forest, like that there's a maritime forest within their community. They say their community is within a maritime forest, which is a really cool perspective, as they recognize that they are in and part of this environment. So again, here is that base map of, or that original kind of layout of Amelia Island Plantation. And what's really neat is I know a landscape architect, and he was an intern, and he lives in Amelia Island Plantation. He was an intern when Ian McHarg and his team were down here doing this project, which is really cool. So he has a really unique perspective on this story too. But essentially, they mapped out all of that southern part of southern Amelia Island, or where the plantation is supposed to be, and they identified like ecological areas. They've identified depths to water table, susceptibility to erosion, drainage classifications, conditions for footings and foundations. They've even looked at like forest types, like relative abundance of forest types. And what they ended up starting to do is they started to overlap and overlay all this data to help with their decision making in these conservation built environment kind of overlap. And they kind of created these suitability maps. And in these suitability maps, like kind of here, this is a conservation management suitability. So you have your first level, which is like we need to conserve this, to your fifth level, like a low conservation priority type of area. Similarly, they did the same thing for residential and resort suitability. First level is like where's the highest suitability for the built environment, where's the lowest priority for the built environment. So that fifth level. And then still they kind of took a little bit further and they started to overlay all of this area to essentially determine where's the best location for conservation, where's the least. Where is the best place to put certain types of environments, where are buildings like medium density or high density, where is not. And they used all this environmental context to help determine how this community is going to look as part of balancing development and the environment, which is really cool because here we are. It's the foundation to thinking of here's a community that's built within and is part of the maritime forest. And that's how essentially we got to this day. Now, of course, Amelia Island Plantation has been here for um, 50 years now, but as part of that, you need to maintain it. Those environments, those conditions, those spaces or places rather, need to be maintained and they need to be taken care of. Because what prevents a community, in any type of HOA, a builder and developer leaves and it all becomes homeowner controlled, how do you make sure that that homeowner controlled community is maintaining that initial character of the built environment or that intent of what it's supposed to look like? So there needs to be cultivation of that social context, of that placemaking. Once it exists, it doesn't exist in perpetuity. It has to be part of the culture. It has to be part of those conversations. So how do they move forward in managing those natural areas? Thinking about, hey, we have this really cool foundation, really tying our community to this balance of the natural and built environment to maintain these natural environments or these natural resources, such as our urban canopy. But now what? How do we maintain it? How do we take care of it? So this is one of the crux of like today's conversation, and I have a couple like challenges that kind of pop up whenever we are managing these types of projects. So one question I want to ask, I have a couple questions. One question I want to ask you all are, what are the major challenges you experience when working with a community to adopt community-wide changes? Is that something that you had to work with? What are some of those major challenges you experience? Or rather, what are some of the major challenges you'd expect people to experience? And I'll encourage you, if you want, go ahead and you can unmute yourself and you can ask any questions that you may have.
Right now, in development here, one thing that I run into a lot is people not having an understanding of the benefit of having green space in their communities. And so
Right.
I think the challenge is really the psychology of these places and I guess getting people, winning them over to our side and aligning with the benefits for them in the community.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a big challenge I have.
That is a huge challenge. And that's one that we see a lot because so much of it, you're seeing these abstract, not all the time, but you see a lot of abstract impacts or benefits to those things. Like how do you communicate public health? That allows someone to understand it. How do you communicate that economic value of like I always imagine like one story I always try to tell people is like the value of having that green space to make it more walkable is thinking of, I always use downtown Fernandina Beach as an example. It's a commercial corridor, a commercial district, this historic district that has shopping and restaurants. There's these large canopy trees, some invasive that I don't like being out there, but we also have some really nice canopy like live oak trees. It's an incredibly comfortable space to walk through, especially, in the summer when it's hot. You have some shade, you can experience that. And then I try to say, now imagine what that space feels like if there was no canopy there. It's hot, it's uncomfortable, you don't want to experience it. So I always, and then sometimes I use that, people will click, it's like, oh yeah, there is this benefit that we can see. But there's a lot of these different ecosystem services that we can always try to communicate. But when I'm working with HOAs, one of the biggest goals that the HOA boards and the builders have is maintain property values, maintain enhanced property values. So I always try to make sure that I'm framing a lot of my conversations and how it has a direct impact on property values, just because that is essentially the whole goal of a lot of those HOAs and community associations is, why is this valuable? But there is a lot of conflict, because if there's tree failure, it's like, well, yeah, if you have a nice urban canopy, you're going to see more incidents of tree failure because there is a higher density of canopy, but it's a bias that you're seeing. There's thousands of trees in this area and you're seeing a couple tree failure. Now, if you're in an HOA that had significantly less density, there's a lot less protection from the wind. The you'll actually have more incidences of tree failure because just there's less protection, but you're just not going to see it as much because you don't have the total density of the trees. So it's like a survivability bias that we see in that. So I'm always trying to think of ways that we can communicate those other benefits to people. But ultimately with HOAs and communities, I think about, they exist to help protect and maintain property values. I try to show how it protects and maintains property values as well as enhance property values. If we can show how it enhances property values and we have that economic impact tied to it, you're going to get a lot of more buy-in to it. But also we'll go through some of this other ways that we can get buy-in from the public as well, because that's important.
Thank you.
Absolutely. The next question that I kind of have is like, who should be a part of planning and decision making that is commonly left out of the conversation? That's another big challenge. So
I
in
think the
this one, oh, go ahead.
community in general, I was just going to say, I think here for us, it's the community in general, right? You get these big projects and it's the city and other partners, but it's the developer primarily driving it, right? And their goal is to make money. So how expensive is the question is usually where I stand, but I think, more voices would be more powerful than mine. And I think
You
that's the community members.
you are 100% correct. Yes. So we see in a lot of projects now, there are some times there's like the builders and developers based off of land use code requirements. There's community voice that can come into it, but it's a little bit different process to a certain extent because of just of how that is set up through local governments. But nonetheless, is the community voice. That's an incredibly important part of the puzzle, because usually we're trying to come up with these plans, these different management plans. We need to think about the problems that we're trying to address. And when we're thinking about the problems we're trying to address, who are the experts of the problem? Is it the decision makers or is it the community? It's the community. So how can we make sure that we're bringing them into the conversation as part of that decision making? Because it's going to actually have a more successful, um, a bigger impact and more successful implementation. Um, and that's why I want to tie back into the conversation of placemaking. So in this placemaking, with community-based participation at its center, an effective placemaking process capitalizes on local communities' assets. So think of the context we're in right now, the natural resources, so that their assets, the inspiration and potential, and it results in the creation of quality public spaces that contribute to people's health, happiness, and well-being. That's what placemaking can do, is you're creating an environment that that leans into those communities' assets and it has a significant impact on the community and the people's health, happiness, and well-being. An incredibly important story that we learned in landscape architecture program is a community one time, and landscape architects was hired as a consultant to come into a community to help with an urban, like downtown revitalization. And they kind of came in like, hey, here's this huge project. This is how we imagine this community is going to look. And they got mad. They got so mad. They loved everything about it except for one part. And what that one part was is the landscape architect, when they looked at a plan, they saw a empty gravel lot at the end of their main street, and they're like, this is gonna be a hub for like a farmer's market, or like create something to put there. And the community got really mad because yes, it was just a gravel lot. Looking in, we just saw an empty space. But that space was incredibly important for that community because that space was for community gathering, like informal town hall meetings. It was a space for people to collaborate and come together, as where groups would meet. And even though it was an empty gravel lot, it had an it was an incredibly significant place for that community. So their asset, even if it was just this gravel empty lot, it had a significant value to the community's happiness and well-being. It had value to them. That was the place. So what happened in that situation is that landscape architect didn't take in the community's perspective and value that they have to the place. The landscape architect looked at it as a space to be designed and made better, and they discounted the experts of that problem or the experts of that community. In placemaking, you can create an incredibly powerful plan that goes nowhere if you don't consider the value it has to the community. But if you do, and you think of placemaking as how do we create an environment that helps with intentionality, capitalizes on the assets, inspiration, potential, and that results in that creation of quality public spaces that contribute to people's health, happiness, and well-being, you're going to have a successful project and program. But how do you do that? How do you do that? And at the foundation of the development of this baseline asset study is a strategy that we use with Extension and the community and some of our other local partners to kind of help push them forward in development of this. And that is through what we call participatory planning. So participatory planning is a collaborative approach and decision making in which community members, stakeholders, and relevant parties engage in shaping policies, plans, and initiatives together. So, going on to what we already talked about is like thinking from like a very traditional model. It's like, yeah, you can have your decision makers that lead to a specific solution, but in that participatory planning model, we can have decision makers in the public or the experts of the program come together through this planning model to lead to a more impactful solution. So what we're doing is we have like these key, like these specialized groups. You can have your real estate management companies. You can have your builders, your developers, your planners, your landscape architects, your green industry professionals, your arborists, whomever it might be. Yeah, they can create a plan to help address problems. But how do you have a more successful plan? That is when you actually bring in the community into this discussion to help lead towards that solution. Now, I will admit, in this model, um, it can take a little bit longer because you have to cultivate relationships, you have to cultivate discussions, you have to cultivate those opportunities to learn and to engage in order to be able to act and do. So there are benefits. We see that it builds ownership. That ownership that has credibility of intervention. So what you were doing or the things that you end up doing within the community, the people in the community are aware of it. They're part of it. They got to see how that plan came to be. They had a voice in that process. So it helps develop community ties and it actually enhances placemaking because you're creating an environment that allows people to be a part of those changes to help create better connection to the community in which they exist. So there's always discussion, socially, in the world today, there's a lack of community. There is a lack of community, but a lot of that is because there's a lack of placemaking. We've lost that intentional connection that we have with our environment because we socially decided it's not as important anymore. But in fact, that placemaking is an integral part of our community and community development. But again, some of the drawbacks, it takes longer. It takes longer. I could sit down with a team and we can create a design and solve all the problems in the world, but then there's no buy-in. So it takes longer in order to implement this. Education is needed because you need to inform those key stakeholders, community members, on some of the information so they can be more educated in making and contributing in that decision-making process. And then you have to make sure that the right people are present. So thinking about placemaking through participatory planning, there's actually 7 steps that we can go through. The first one is just launching, and that launch is you can create a planning committee. They're not necessarily decision making, but they're just a planning committee, make sure everything's moving forward. And that can be some of those key community decision makers. Next is to seek to understand. And that understanding is essentially doing an analysis, an inventory analysis. What exists? What does it mean? How does it impact our community decision making? Next is going to be explore. Let's explore ideas. And I want to go back and say at the understanding step, you can bring in the community to seek more about the problems, to understand more about the problems, to explore solutions, have the community work in that exploration of solution, that brainstorming. Have the community then go and work on how do we decide to move forward? What's going to be the best actionable items that we can do as a community in our decision making? And the next comes act, the act of doing the things that the community has decided upon. And then you can inaugurate it, have some type of celebration, celebrate that the community is working towards these changes together. But then you need to evaluate. You need to evaluate and see, are our actions working? You know, is it worth doing a lot of things if we don't understand the true impact of them? It's hard to say. So it's important to evaluate how well we are doing towards meeting our goals and our objectives. And then it's a cyclical process because this is kind of like a planning. And in planning, we always say comprehensive, cooperative, and continual. So this is a continual process that we're going through with our communities. And yes, sometimes you may do step 5 before 4, or you might do step 6 as part of 4. So you might move things and shuffle things around, but this is the traditional kind of framework. And as such, we've actually created a community canopy toolkit. And this is a toolkit for communities that have canopies, like or urban forest, and they can actually go through this process and they can work with their local extension office to go through participatory planning so they can identify their own objectives. They can understand problems, identify their own objectives, and figure out how they're going to work towards them. So essentially a framework for doing participatory planning with their individual communities. And that's what this toolkit helps do. But then there are other ways that we can look at how can extension get involved in this process. So extension is, of course, there's the education that's part of it. There's education and expertise. We can bring in our resources as an unbiased research-based information in that decision making. We can help with community facilitation. So how are we helping facilitate these events and activities to help lead communities in this ideation, decision making, and acting sequence? But as well as how can extension help with that developing the canopy action plan, as well as how can we look at initial assessments and impact documentation, so as part of that evaluation criteria. So extension can fit in this entire 7-step process, and how an extension agent or someone from the university has the ability to help work with communities in order to develop these plans. And essentially, this is the process. This is the product that came out recently, but this is the process that me and the co-author, or like I went through with Amelia Island Plantation when the co-author of this publication and I started working on it. So nonetheless, this is how extension can get involved, and extension can perform extension services and outreach through this Canopy action plan. But that has led to, going through this process has led to or contributed to this baseline asset study that Amelia Island Plantation Community Association has created. So I want to put all of this now in the context of the 7 steps of participatory planning. So we launched it. We actually started this project, initial discussion with the Extension Office almost 4 years ago. When I first started in Nassau County, I got a phone call saying, hey, Dr. Clem, can you come help with this? And it's like, yes. And that's where the conversation started. And that kind of was like the launch of who are those players that can help ensure that the community's moving this forward. So that involved part of like their nonprofit association, which is Amelia Island Plantation Community Association, as well as the homeowners and the environmental asset committee. So we had different players that could all get involved with this. So we've had sessions of doing understanding, exploring, where I would do education. But one of the really cool ways is it wasn't just me that's helping with the education is, to understand a lot of the information for baseline data, we turned it into community events. So our natural resource extension agent, Dave A. Bayer, he would do birding activities where he would meet with the community out on the beach and they would do bird counts to kind of say, hey, throughout the year, here's the diversity or the type of birds that we would see at different times of the year. And they did it over a couple years and they'd get these bird counts. So he's teaching a lot of the community about the natural resources and where they live, but they're also collecting data that contributed towards the baseline information. But the community also hired some consultants to do like timber cruising, essentially, of their entire community. So they did a tree inventory assessment where they looked at healthy trees, poor trees, et cetera. We measured DBH. So we've been able to actually calculate the basal area density of the entire community to kind of identify where is the canopy too dense, where is it very thin, and how does that impact decision making? So we've launched the project and we've gone through a process of understanding and exploring and some deciding and acting. But ultimately, that environmental assets committee, that report is that point where they say, hey, we've we've done a lot of seeking to understand and exploring a bunch of different options. And now we as a community can decide on what we're going to do. And now they're looking at, let's decide, how do we act? And then they can evaluate along the way. And tied into that entire process is how's Extension helping support them? How are we helping guide them in their decision making? Because I'm not the expert of their community needs, they are, but we can help facilitate and provide the tools so they can be the ones that are making the decision making. So we've gone from a community that was initially built thinking about how do we balance the built and natural environment to maintaining that placemaking or that identity, but then also thinking about how does that play a role into leading this community even further into the future, especially as Nassau County is one of the fastest, most urbanizing counties in the state. And it's going to have big impacts, but at the center of all of it is that participatory planning approach where we're bringing in the community and the experts of the problems, the community members, so they can be part of that decision making to help with the so they can be part of that decision making for their community into the future. But anyways, so that's it for my presentation, and I know we still have some time left for any possible questions. And my contact information is up here, and I do have a podcast, Cultivating Curiosity, and conveniently, the episode that came out this month is Doing, Thinking, Feeling. It's the creative heart of landscape architecture. We're actually interviewed Dr. Ryan Hargrove from University of Kentucky, and we talk a lot about the role landscape architects have in placemaking and identity and creative thinking as part of design process. So there's a lot of overlap with what we've talked about today and this month's podcast, and that was purely coincidence. I didn't actually plan that. So, but thank you all, and I think we have some questions.
Thank you so much, Taylor. um, I want to first open it up to the group to see if they have any questions from your presentation. And then I have a couple of questions myself. So
Yeah.
if anyone would like to ask any questions to Dr. Clem, feel free to unmute yourself and you can ask your questions.
I came in a little late, but what I caught sounded really great. It sounds like You're the champion for your local extension agency, and I love to hear it. I really commend your efforts.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
So Taylor, I had a couple questions. As you were presenting, you were talking about um, really trying to get as many people in the community involved in this process. And I wanted to ask, how are you able to convince stakeholders that a participatory planning process is worthwhile? Because you also mentioned that it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of resources. So how are
Mhm.
you able to convince people that this is something that is a necessary step?
Well, it's kind of funny because convincing the community that this is a necessary step wasn't actually needed. It was convincing the committee and the board that this is the best process we go through. Now, of course, when I was communicating with them, I wasn't saying, let's go through the 7 steps of participatory planning in order to develop their plan. No, it was just more of what are their biggest needs? And then we kind of just laid out a framework together, which included, here are my recommendations of the best process that we can go through, and here are the values of it. And that's where I talk about the placemaking. We talked about landscape resiliency, like those benefits, and community buy-in, and that communicated to them like really well, because they did desire to make sure they had a good plan. And how I framed it is like, this is the process that we can kind of go through. And what you're going to do is you're going to go from a plan that works to a plan that's going to be like rise above the rest, essentially. And it gives value because thinking about a committee, I told him it gives them a mission essentially that the committee can work on. So it's not just a guiding document that the committee works on and that's the end of the day. It gives them an opportunity to have something that kind of shapes and evolves and moves with the community as it needs. And they saw that dynamic nature as incredibly enticing because it gave them an opportunity to really think about as communities' needs change, how do we change as well? So they bought into it pretty quickly. And honestly, you can move through the process much quicker, but because of the scale and their resources available, they can only phase it in as they could. But they've invested a lot of time and energy into this. It's been really great. So they saw value in it, which was nice. But it wasn't the committee or the community that I had to like convince, but just more of that committee. And we talked about here's a framework that we can kind of go through, and these are the benefits of it.
Mhm.
So, and some of the cool things that came out of it is it wasn't just during the initial discussions, they were able to invest and they actually hired a full-time environmental resource manager. So they have someone that's now on the staff of the association that is helping implement and actually do this plan, which is really cool. So they've invested a lot into this, and that I think that is one value that this community has over others. I guess is it's made it easier. Is they have a much larger pool of funds that they can pull from to implement these compared to other communities. So if an extension agent or somebody is doing a similar framework of the community, it's scalable. It's very scalable. You can turn this into a weekend activity. You can do it as a progressional activity over time. So it is very scalable based off of the community's needs and their resources.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think as a follow-up question to that, how would you recommend that others identify who those community decision makers are, like who those key community decision makers are that should be involved in this process? Or
So
how do you identify if you're missing participants? Like how what like I guess what I mean to say is like how do you know if you don't know if you're missing someone?
100%, 100%. So the initial like discussion with like the planning committees, we tried to outline who are all those important people. We who can be involved, and that started the conversation. But what they ended up doing is over time that they would reach out and they would learn like here are some more key integral people, and they would try to make sure that they were brought into that discussion because you're not going to grab everybody, but your goal is to make sure that you get the population or that target audience I don't like using that word per se, but you can attract the target audience that has value in this, or it can provide impact or input into this. So, but your goal is to not necessarily be perfect with it, but to try to capture the best audience that you can, to allow you to still move forward in the activities as well, so you don't get bogged down as well. So it's a balance, I guess. But they would get like send surveys out. That's one thing that did, is like send out surveys to the community, and they'd ask for some feedback. They wouldn't necessarily ask for specific contacts or people that could be part of it, but they would ask for like, where are some missing pieces and things that we can make sure that we're including in as part of this process.
Yeah, it sounds like overall there's a lot of data collection that happens throughout this process. And
Mhm.
is that something that you would say Extension is able to play a strong role in participating in that data collection process?
Absolutely, because I mean, we have a lot of the resources, but the biggest thing that we need to consider is, how do we make sure that we are achieving our extension mission when doing these activities? And if I was just going to go out to do data collection, it doesn't necessarily tie into my role as a county extension agent. Now, if somebody like a state specialized agent with extension, they probably have more capability just to do that data collection, and how it fits their responsibilities. But so that's why it's important that as part of the data collection in this process, we also tied it to extension activities that we can do, like bio blitzes, like those birding activities. Master gardeners actually would write articles for the community newsletter on different topics, and that would get published out to them. So we look at those different avenues that we can provide information that can aid in data collection, but they recognize this, the community, and that's why they did hire consultants to help get them a lot of the data that they needed, because it some of the data collection couldn't be fulfilled by achieving our mission per se.
Hmm. Yeah. Are there any other questions for Taylor or questions for the group at large? Is this something that maybe now you are all interested in, now hearing about how to integrate participatory methods in community projects?
And I do want to know, it's a great way to build relationships with your community. It feels kind of strange as an extension agent to say, oh, I went to a restaurant and we just sat down and just drank coffee for a couple hours and we just talked about the problems the community is having to address. That was worth its weight in gold in laying the foundation of this. And it seems kind of strange when you think about us doing like traditional educational activities, but building that relationship was incredibly valuable for us to have a deeper understanding of what we could and can do within the partnership together.
Yeah, I hear that. I also am still kind of getting used to this idea that is often what collaboration in some of these community level partnerships looks like. Um, and I know here in Alachua County, whenever there's a real big land development project that is happening, really no matter what it is, uh, the landowners and other responsible parties are required to hold a neighborhood workshop where I I went to one recently and the joke was, we have to let the neighbors come yell at us for 4 hours. And luckily they only yelled at us for about 1 hour. And the other three were was like really constructive conversations. And a lot of the folks who were kind of the ones with the megaphones on Reddit and Facebook were the ones who were also the most excited to talk about all of the dynamics of, what was upsetting to them about the project. And, way before the end of the event, um, we not only were on kind of the same page and they realized that, we weren't trying to destroy them and their way of life and everything that they love. But, also like little things like, we have a lot of, it's Gainesville, so this is kind of par for the course, but it's like we have a lot of mutual friends. We appreciate a lot of the same local businesses, and how much they want to see, their character, their neighborhood, kind of zoning that, kind of helps characterize it, all that kind of stuff aligned with the, what we were trying to do. And I thought it was really great that the county makes people do that. But I'm not sure, Dr. Clem, if that's the case everywhere. Do you know, if that's not the case somewhere, how can you, how can you bring about that change to kind of, introduce a face, but also a level of accountability on the part of people who are looking to make, changes like that?
Yeah, that's a great example because I don't, to answer your question briefly, I don't know if there's any type of requirement that municipalities or local governments have to require that to happen, where there is some type of workshop. But I definitely get that the reasoning behind it, because it may not be a full participatory planning opportunity, but what you're doing is you're creating an environment that takes value into that discussion or that decision making. Um, because how a lot of times, kind of like mirroring what you mentioned, um, and even something I see where Stephanie put in the chat box is connecting over shared values are a lot of times when we're dealing with contentious topics. I do find that at the root of it all, the ultimate goal is the same. Everybody has a lot of the same goals. It's just how do we get there might look different. And then once we have the ability to highlight, like, here are those commonalities and kind of soothe like unwarranted expectations, I think that helps with stronger consensus building. So when you have, as part of that exploring process within the 7 steps of participatory planning, is you're exploring and trying to understanding is, you're not necessarily understanding just the environmental impacts, but there's the social part of it. So when we think about an inventory analysis, there is that social component to it. So that has to be part of that conversation. So the minute that you give that opportunity for people to speak about it, provide input on it in a constructive way, like a workshop, that's fantastic. Because if you think about the typical platform that people may have, say like a BOCC meeting, you get up, you just have 3 minutes to talk about the topic to the board, and that's kind of it. There's other these workshop opportunities, or facilitating these workshops allows for us to dive deeper into those topics through that facilitated effort, as long as it's guided well. And one of the other benefits that I see when this happens is that whoever is facilitating it has to be open and honest in that conversation, because I've seen workshops go poorly because essentially whoever's leading it already had the final document planned, and their goal is just to help facilitate discussion to get people to agree to something they've already done. And that's not going to work. It's like, how do we come in the middle and have a good balance of them? And that's where that's part of the understanding, is going to be a key part in facilitating success. And I think those workshops can be very beneficial in doing that. And I think that's what you experienced. Because yeah, there's going to be people upset, but that's fine. People are allowed to have that. But then how do we create this new norm and move together in consensus building and decision making?
Great. Thank you so much, Taylor. I just want to thank you for coming and talking to us about this project. And I'm really excited to hear about how it continues to develop.
Oh, absolutely.
So before we go, because we are just about at time, I just want to go ahead and share with you all our schedule for the next speaker. So our next speaker will be PhD candidate Stephanie Stoudemeyer. And she's going to be sharing with us about using the urban forest to reconnect people to nature. And that will be on December 3rd will be our next presentation. And you can go ahead and register for that or for the following presentation using this QR code down here. This presentation will be on our School of Forest, Fisheries, and Geomatic Sciences YouTube page. So you can feel free to look that up later, or you can share with others, your colleagues, friends, and families. And then finally, as I mentioned at the top of the meeting, it really helps for you to share your feedback on this presentation and this event, or rather this series. And that helps to inform and shape the way that we set up future events and series. So if you could please share with us your experiences in our survey. Our survey is here with this QR code, and I'll also drop in the chat the link to this as well. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, for participating, for sharing your experiences, and for sharing your questions. And thank you again, Dr. Taylor Clem, for joining us today.
Thank you all. I really appreciate it. You all have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Take care.